Resident Evil has had its ups and downs over the years, but the one thing that it has consistently been known for, more or less, is good boss fights, especially final boss fights. Though there have been a couple of dips here and there in this area as well, there have been a lot of really good stuff over the years too. In this feature, we'll be ranking the mainline Resident Evil boss fights from worst to best. So without further ado, let's get started. Number 20. Derek Simmons' Resident Evil 6 Ada's Campaign. Resident Evil 6 is no stranger to criticism, but while the parts of the game that series fans hate most are those that are a bit too ridiculous and explosion-y, the final boss fight against Simmons in Ada's campaign could have used some of that. The biggest sin that this boss commits is that it's dull. It's easy to settle into a superficial pattern and make your way through a significant portion of the fight, just going through the motions, without any real challenge or engagement. Number 19. G. Final Form, Resident Evil 2 1998, Scenario B. If the preceding boss fight against Super Tyrant was the final encounter in Scenario B of either character in the original Resident Evil 2, it would be placed much higher on this list. However, that's not the final boss of the second scenario. Instead, players stand in front of the final form of the G-Virus mutated William Birkin, and though he looks fearsome enough, all there really is to it is just standing there and mindlessly unloading ammo into him until the cutscene plays. Number 18. G. Final Form, Resident Evil 2 2019, Second Run. There really aren't a lot of differences in the final face-offs against G in the remake of Resident Evil 2 and the original. Really, they're mechanically pretty much identical. The only really reason why we've ranked this one higher is because it's powered by the RE engine, and G's final form is rendered in disgusting, horrifying, excruciating detail, and it's a sight to behold. Number 17. EVELINE, Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 was the long-awaited return to form that series fans had been hoping for, but the game faltered a bit right at the end. Though there's a couple of intense and memorable boss fights in the game, the very final fight against EVELINE is, well, it's pretty bland. Visually, some part of you can't help but be impressed with what's being shown on screen, but the actual playing part of it all feels horrible, unchallenging, and one note. Not a fitting way to finish off an otherwise excellent game. Number 16. Leech Queen, Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 is perhaps the most divisive RE game from the series' fixed camera days, and it's easy to see why. Its plotting story, its torturous inventory management, and some annoyingly implemented gimmicks make it a game that most have mixed feelings about. It's fitting, then, that the final boss of the game isn't particularly exciting. Credit where it's due, mechanically and design-wise, the Queen Leech boss fight is solid enough, for the most part, but knowing how good the boss fights in Resident Evil usually tend to be, this one feels more like a black sheep, or a gray one at any rate. Number 15. Javier, Resident Evil: The Darkside Chronicles. While the Darkside Chronicles' final boss battle deserves credit for its visual design, and for helping lend more backstory to the character of Jack Krauser, it's not the most thrilling as an actual encounter from a mechanics perspective. The whole fight is oddly static. Javier's attacks aren't all that threatening, and he doesn't have that many attacks to begin with. As a result, the boss ends up feeling repetitive and monotonous once the impression from its solid visual design wears off after the first couple of minutes. Number 14. USTANAK, Resident Evil 6 Jake and Sherry's Campaign. The USTANAK was a pretty fearsome foe in Jake and Sherry's campaign in Resident Evil 6, but he did not stick the landing with his final appearance. The final encounter against USTANAK deserves props for having visual flair, and for moving through multiple stages, but none of these are mechanically very interesting. Initially, running around USTANAK to avoid his damage and dealing tons of damage to him from a safe distance is all too easy. Meanwhile, later on, an over-reliance on QTEs and a gimmick involving Sherry, which turns her into nearly a bystander instead of an actual participant in the fight, both sour the experience. Number 13. Derek Simmons, Resident Evil 6 Leon and Helena's Campaign. Though the face-off against Derek Simmons in Ada's RE6 campaign is a pretty dull affair, his appearance as the final boss of Leon and Helena's campaign is much better executed. There's a semblance of a challenge here, fun mechanics to make use of to deal extra damage to the boss, and is a visual treat as well. It's far from the best this series has to offer, but it's not a bad final boss either. Number 12. HAOS, Resident Evil 6, Chris and Pierce's campaign. HAOS is a pretty cool final boss, at least because of his visual design if nothing else. And though he's not the most difficult and can be fairly easy to cheese if you can juggle your QTEs and melee attacks properly, this is still a pretty fun encounter. The most interesting element here is the different abilities available to both Chris and Pierce. Not the most outstanding boss, but certainly a highlight in one of the single worst campaigns in the mainline RE series. Number 11. T002, Resident Evil. The first Resident Evil was a revelation, no pun intended, capturing intense horror, palpable dread and atmosphere, and challenging and engaging game design at the same time. These were qualities that the game displayed consistently, but the final boss against the tyrant underneath the Spencer Mansion is a bit too easy. Keeping your distance and chipping away at him from a distance is a strategy that works out for much of the fight. Still, the tyrant isn't a complete pushover, and appropriately within the context, far from battle ready. Though there's certainly room for improvement here, the tyrant boss fight still serves as a serviceable conclusion to a masterpiece. Number 10. William Birkin, Resident Evil 2, 1998, Scenario A. Though not nearly as imposing or freaky looking as the final form of G, William Birkin's appearance as the final boss of the original RE2's first scenario is far more engaging. The G virus mutation has taken over Birkin completely, turning him into a terrifying beast, and his attacks and movements make it hard to pin him down. To be perfectly honest, this is still one of the easier boss fights in the original Resident Evil 2, especially if you've been smart with your ammo and health up to this point, but it's still a great way to end the game's first campaign. Number 9. SERGEI VLADIMIR, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. You get to play as Albert Wesker, and you get to fight against one of his longtime rivals, and your actions lead to the downfall of Umbrella. The narrative context surrounding this fight already makes it one that Resident Evil fans can't help but appreciate, but happily enough, it's a fun fight, even from a gameplay perspective. Sure, it's not the most difficult fight in the game, but SERGEI's mobility, his visual design, and a decent variety to his movesets make this a fight that demands engagement and attention from its players. Number 8. Osmund Saddler, Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is absolutely brimming with great boss fights. The entire game is essentially a gauntlet of one struggle after another, interspersed regularly by even more desperate struggles against horrifying monstrosities. Among these, the final fight against Saddler doesn't rank among the best. The likes of Krauser, Mendez, or even El Gigante, for instance, are easily better, but it's still a pretty damn good fight. It keeps you on your toes, presents a fair bit of challenge, especially on professional difficulty, while it also feels like a well-earned conclusion after the way the story had built up to it over the course of several hours. Number 7. Alex Wesker, Resident Evil Revelations 2. Resident Evil Revelations 2 was a shining ray of hope for RE fans at a time when the series was at its lowest. In many ways, the true beginnings of the series' revival. Fittingly enough, it ended on an excellent conclusion, with Alex Wesker, the second of only 2 survivors of Spencer's twisted Wesker project, being the final hurdle players come up against. A moment of fear culminates in her getting taken over and mutated by the T-Phobos virus, leading to a multi-stage, thrilling boss fight that ends with a bang. Number 6. Jack Norman, Resident Evil Revelations. Resident Evil Revelations was, for the longest time, the closest the series had gone to its slower horror roots since RE4, and its final boss fight felt like a fitting conclusion to that. Arduous, at times genuinely challenging, against a foe who looked as menacing as he really was. Jack Norman doesn't go down easily, and his attacks can hit hard, while visually this entire fight is an absolute treat. Even on the 3DS, back in 2012, this was good enough to gawk at. Number 5. Nemesis, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. If we were talking about Nemesis as an enemy or monster in general and not just a final boss, he would probably be very close to the top of this list, if not the very top. However, as much of a terrifying and menacing presence he is in all of Resident Evil 3, the final fight against him isn't nearly as tough. Regardless, it is still a hell of a finale. Nemesis' disgusting final form, all rotting flesh and tentacles, is appropriately repulsive, and moving around the arena to line him up with the rain cannon shots is a great central gimmick for the encounter. Here's hoping the upcoming remake can make this fight even better. Speaking of remakes making fights better, Number 4. Super Tyrant, Resident Evil 2 2019, Leon A. The T-00 or Mr. X had been notorious among the veteran Resident Evil circles for 2 decades, but with last year's RE2 remake he broke into the mainstream. He was an absolute menace, a constant and relentless pursuer who injected unbelievable tension into the game. The final boss fight against him in the Leon A campaign is a spectacle, a fitting send-off to him. It is dramatic, it poses plenty of challenge, it is visually breathtaking, and it feels like a great place to end that section of the story. Not too terribly different from what our next entry does as well. Number 3. William Birkin, Resident Evil 2 2019, Claire A. Mr. X isn't the only one who was elevated by Resident Evil 2 2019's remake. So too was William Birkin, who slowly and torturously becomes more and more mutated and possessed by an ever-growing self-injected dose of the G virus. The final encounter against him in Claire A, not the second run fight, which as you'll remember we ranked quite low, is an extremely memorable encounter. Birkin has a lot of attacks to keep you on your toes, such as climbing along the walls and jumping back onto the elevator from a distance, or jumping over the car in the middle and attacking you from above, or charging at you from a distance. It has all of the strengths that the final encounter against Mr. X does, but thanks to a much more ferocious enemy, it feels even more thrilling. Number 2. Alexia Ashford, Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil Code Veronica is an inconsistent game in many ways. Though it is the peak of Resident Evil's fixed camera design in many ways, in others it has some noticeable flaws. However, not even the game's biggest detractors would deny that it has one of the best boss fights in the entire series. A multi-legged fight that starts out challenging and completely drains you by the time you're done. This is an intense, engaging battle that constantly keeps you on your toes. Add to that great music, great narrative culmination, and a great progression of the fight itself, and what you have is one of the most memorable conclusions to a Resident Evil game we've ever experienced. Number 1. Albert Wesker, Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 catches a lot of flack from people, and a lot of it is justified, but there are some areas where the game's quality is just undeniable. How well it still holds up visually, how tight the shooting feels, how good it is as a co-op action game, but most importantly, how narratively rewarding it is for the most heavily invested in the series' story. It's payoff after payoff, and the biggest payoff of them all comes with Chris and Shiva's climactic showdown against Albert Wesker, one of the greatest video game villains of all time. Be it in terms of the story context, or the way it ends, or how mechanically solid it is, or how visually epic it is, the final fight against Albert Wesker is excellent in more ways than one. It is, without a doubt, the greatest final boss in the series' history. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.